Hi everyone, this is Allegra Integra, and today I am going to go over my September reading wrap-up. If the lighting looks a little funny today, it is actually way too late for me to be filming this, but I'm wanting to get it out of the way. I'm wanting to get these videos up, and I've just been really busy, so it's really late. I'm using what lighting I have available to me, and it kind of lends to the beginning spooky season because I got some of that glow going on. Whatever, we're gonna make it work because this is what I've got. I want to start off with stats. I've gotten really into looking at my stats. I don't know why. It's probably because I'm using StoryGraph. I may or may not put some infographics up here. I'm still working on that, and I'm wanting to get this up in a timely manner, so please forgive me if you're just looking at my mostly beautiful plants as they get ready for winter, and I'm very worried about that. Anyway, in the month of September, I read 8 books. And I read those in multiple formats like I usually do. A few of these I did read in more than one format. If you watch my Unhinged Women vlog, you'll see that I read and then listened to part of a book. But I'm going by what I did the most of. So of the formats I read this month, one of the books was digital. 2 of them were audio, completely done via audio, and 5 were at least partially read in print. And 7 of those 8 books were from the library. That makes me really happy because I am trying to be a library user more and more. I kind of fell off the bandwagon and bought a lot of books when a local bookshop or local-ish bookshop opened up last year when I had just been a huge library user. And I still plan on supporting my indie bookstore, but my library is awesome and I want to continue to utilize those resources. I am also needing to be careful about how many library books I check out at once because I get a little bit lofty in my goals and I don't want to be turning books in late. As a mood reader, I have to be really careful about what I actually check out because my library doesn't give you fines, which I think is great when we're talking from an equity standpoint and what libraries are supposed to be, but I still want to respect those due dates so other patrons can read these books instead of having them gather dust in my library bookshelf. In the month of September, I'd say I had a pretty good reading month if we're talking about ratings. I've been feeling a little weird about ratings, but I'm still doing it right now because it's another stat. Just know that if I say something is a 3-star or above, I consider it a recommendation. A 2-star is something I wouldn't recommend, and a 1-star is going to be pretty rare from me. So if something's a 1-star, it either sorely disappointed me or absolutely I think should not even be read by anybody. But 3-star doesn't mean I think it's bad. It just means it didn't blow me out of the water in any way. 4-star means it was really, really good, and a 5-star for me is going to be much more rare, and that's going to be an absolute favorite. And this month I had 1 5-star read, which was a reread, 4 4-star reads, 1 3-star read, 1 2-star read, and 1 that I did not rate, and I will get into why when I get to that book. Genre-wise, it was a pretty horror-heavy month with 4 of the 8 books being horror. 1 book I would categorize as sci-fi, 1 book was nonfiction, 1 falls into that contemporary, literary, kind of in-betweeny genre, and then 1 was a middle-grade contemporary book. To get started, I'm going to talk about the 3 books I read for my reading vlog about unhinged women or like sad girl books, more unhinged women than sad girl, I suppose. I will link that vlog down below if you want some more in-depth conversations about 2 of the 3 books that I'm going to talk about here. But first and foremost, what I read, or what I'm going to talk about anyway, is Woman Eating, and that's by Claire Kohda. This is a horror novel. That's how I would classify it. It was definitely on the literary side of horror as opposed to being gory, slasher, campy. It was not on that side. If this is the spectrum of literary and campy, it was right here. And what this story is we're following a young woman who is actually a vampire and is having to venture out on her own to find food and really to live on her own for the first time in her life. She is actually 23. She's not going to ever age past that kind of early 20s look, but she has only been on this earth for 23 years. She was turned into a vampire by her mother when she was a baby, and her mother has always taken care of her, gotten her pig's blood because they have not fed on humans, and her mother is declining. She isn't necessarily dying, there's just something going on, and it's never fully alluded to why this is happening, but her mother is implied to be like 300, 400 years old, but she appears to be about in her 40s. And this is a vampire story. This woman is a vampire and she is struggling to figure out how to take care of herself without feeding on people. But at the core of it, it's not a vampire story. This is a coming of age story that really hones in on a couple cultural things. So the main character in this book is also multiracial. She is white as well as Malaysian and Japanese, I believe. And there's some conversations that are just touched on, but it's a thread throughout the entire book about how food is a part of culture and how we explore that, and how not only does she feel alienated because she's not able to participate in that part of her culture, but the way that her mother has treated her vampirism as like a curse and talked about how terrible she is, even though this is a choice that her mother made. There's a lot to be said about what is happening in this book. I ultimately did give this book 4 stars. I think the ending was a little rushed. It's definitely not something I'd call an absolute favorite, but I think a lot of people would get a lot out of this book, especially people who come from those multicultural backgrounds, who have more nuanced takes on food as culture. And I hate saying that because food is absolutely a culture, like part of my cultural heritage as well. But I just think there are layers that I maybe missed or that I didn't get as much out of that someone else might. But I definitely got things out of it, and I would highly recommend this book to most people, especially if you're into that sad girl, unhinged vibe that's happening right now, or that's like really popular right now, or if you're looking for vampire stories that are a new take on the way that we use vampirism as a metaphor. Next, I'm going to talk about A Certain Hunger, and that's by Chelsea G. Summers. This is another horror novel. Most of the Unhinged Women books are going to fall under that, although you could again argue that they're more on the literary side. Some examples of like Unhinged Women books that wouldn't be horror would be a lot of Ottessa Moshfegh or Melissa Broder's work. But this is definitely a horror. Again, it's got that literary twist to it. We're following this woman who is currently in prison because she has been convicted of murder and cannibalism. And then we're following her story about how she came to become a cannibal, why she has killed the men that she has killed, and like the progression that happened, as well as how she got caught, and some introspection on who she is as a person and why she doesn't actually have emotions. The main character is a food critic, and that's made pretty clear not only in the way that she describes food, not just the eating of the men that she's murdered, but food in general, as well as how overwritten this book is. I think the overwriting, like I said in the vlog, I think that this absolutely is intentional. It did make it really hard to follow. A lot of that is probably because I was reading this at a time when I was really busy and I had a lot of things coming up, so it was harder for me to focus on that overwriting. And some of it was that it made me uncomfortable, and I think that is the intention of the story. This is less of a like review on cannibalism or using cannibalism as a metaphor, or though of course that is in here, so much as it is kind of an exploration of what does sociopathy potentially look like when we're looking at it through the mind of a woman who would fall under that. A lot of conversations, a lot of books, a lot of true crime exploration of sociopathy, which by the way is a complicated and controversial term, but I'm gonna use it because it's how the character describes herself. A lot of that is done through the lens of men, and when it is done through the lens of women, it's how is this masculinized. I found that pretty interesting. Again, the overwriting really killed this for me, and I think that there was no twist. This has been pitched as a thriller. I did not find it particularly thrilling. It's pretty straightforward as to like who this person is and that she's going to be killing people. There's some interesting ways that it follows one of her longest relationships and how she kills him. She also doesn't make a ton of sense in her consistency, but that could also be commentary on being an unreliable narrator. I didn't find this as enjoyable as woman eating. That is because it is overwritten. I've said that so many times, you're probably tired of hearing me say it. And just some of the messaging in this fell flat. I did give it 3 stars. I enjoyed the exploration of this character, and I think there were some interesting turns of phrase and the ways that the author didn't shy away from making this character really pretentious throughout her telling things. At least there was consistency there if there wasn't in other parts of her story. Again, could be unreliable narrator, and I was just in a place where I wasn't picking up on a lot of that at the time. But I just did not find this as engaging as woman eating. Next for my Unhinged Women vlog, I can't say that today, but next for that vlog, I read Bunny by Mona Awad. I did not end up finishing Bunny in the vlog, but I did finish it after I got back from Riot Fest in the middle of September. And let me tell you, that book still holds up. It was one of my most favorite books of 2020, and on a reread, being able to look through certain hints and clues to what is actually going on in the main character's mind just made me enjoy the book that much more. I guess I could, maybe tell you the plot if you're not familiar with it. Bunny follows this young woman named Samantha. Her best friend Ava calls her Mackie. It's a play on her last name. And she is a student at a prestigious small school for a writing program. She's getting an MFA. I believe in prose or creative nonfiction, I think might be the suggestion, and she does not get along with her cohort. Since it's such a small school, there are only 4 other women in her writing group, her class, her specific focus, and they all call themselves Bunny, and she is kind of outcast from that group at the beginning of her program. And we meet her at the beginning of the second year when she has made a friend who is an art school dropout named Ava, and they kind of talk shit about the bunnies behind their backs. Until Samantha gets invited to the bunnies' smut salon, which is their super secret, potentially writing meetings that they do, but it turns out it's a lot more than that. This book gets so bonkers weird, and I love how even on rereads you can find different interpretations. I think people are going to have different interpretations about what is real and what is not in this book, depending on what stage of life they're in, with things like feeling isolated in a place where you are supposed to be fully accepted, or just dealing with your own mental health at different periods of time. I don't want to get into spoilers, but I am going to do a deep dive. I really need to do a deep dive on this book eventually, to talk about the themes, to talk about what I think is actually happening and what isn't happening. It's really hard to talk about this without ruining it, but let me tell you, it goes from, this is going to be a hoity-toity book about some poor girl who feels so outcast from her rich school that she's still able to go to, and it goes way off the rails into some really deep, dark, bizarre, and I mean that literally bizarre and surreal turns. This is horror, it's thriller, it's contemporary. It is probably one of the best books that I've read in the last 10 years. Speaking of unhinged women, or at least the unhinged women's trope, I'm going to talk about the book Exalted. This is by Anna Dorn, and the reason I picked this up, this is actually the first book I read in September, was the cover. I saw this in the new releases shelf at my library, and the cover with the title really grabbed my eye. I did read the back, and I thought, okay, this will be interesting, hoping that it might actually have more of a supernatural tilt to it. It absolutely doesn't. This is a contemporary literary fiction. There's nothing actually supernatural about this. What it's about is we're following 2 women. We're following Dawn, who is a 48-year-old woman who has just broken up with her girlfriend, who has a dead-end job. Her son won't talk to her. She refuses to go to therapy because they told her that she has borderline personality disorder, and she thinks, no, it's everybody else's issue, and she's absolutely obsessed with this astrology account called Exalted. Dawn's chapters alternate with chapters from Emily's point of view, and Emily is late 20s, early 30s. She is the curator of the Exalted Instagram page, she's famous-ish for her viral Instagram page about astrology, and she doesn't fully believe in astrology until she meets someone whose sign, or does someone's chart, does someone's chart, whose chart is just completely exalted, meaning the planets are all where they are supposed to be in their highest form, and she becomes obsessed with this man. His name is Beau, and she thinks, I really need to meet him. It's going to fix my life. She's kind of adrift. She's not making that much money with her Instagram page. And she is also struggling with the way that she's connecting with relationships, including friendships. This book, I don't want to say it's bad. I do have a hard time recommending it, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. I did give it 2 stars. A few things. Both characters are unlikable. I like unlikable characters. I like feeling uncomfortable in books. I think that the messaging in this book versus and why it was trying to make me uncomfortable was a bit too far. There's a specific, if you've read this, there's a plot twist which I saw coming from the 3rd chapter, and everyone that I saw in other reviews were it was so shocking and I had no idea, and I felt like it was very, very obvious that this was coming up. not a huge fan of that, and that can be, some people may have thought that that went too far. That, while potentially unnecessary and potentially triggering, is not the thing that made me the most uncomfortable since I saw it coming. There is some pretty accurate but also disparaging portrayals of people with borderline personality disorder or complex PTSD. For personal reasons, some of it was really, really uncomfortable to read. And I also felt like the author may have been villainizing people with these, whilst with these disorders. While a lot of this is relatively accurate, the responses around things like therapy, things like why do people develop these kind of concerns, I didn't find particularly well done. The voices of the characters weren't super strong to me either, even though they're supposed to be very different people. I felt that the big twist was super obvious and silly. So this is very soap opera. Their lives do clearly become intertwined, not only because Dawn reaches out to have her chart read. That actually is just kind of used as an offhand like way for Emily to be like, oh, Dawn's chart is horrible. Like everything, all of her planets are in terrible places. She's the opposite of exalted, but I'm going to tell her what she wants to hear because that's what astrologers do. And I'm not disparaging people who are into astrology. I enjoy it. I'm an Aries. It's fun. But that's what Emily was saying. And that was only used, I think, really to link the thing that I actually did find a bit shocking and kind of funny, darkly funny at the end, and it's not the major twist in this. Yeah, I just didn't like it. You think by now I would learn that cover buys or cover pickups from the library are just gonna sting me, but it is a really beautiful cover. And maybe contemporary stuff isn't for me unless it is hoity-toity literature stuff. I don't know. Wasn't my jam. Also, in the last month, I read A Curious History of Sex by Kate Lister. This is a nonfiction book about sex, but not about every aspect of sex. I think this was really well researched. The chapters are short and punchy. She starts off by talking about different language usage. I'm not going to use the words here because I don't feel like bleeping myself out, but you can probably imagine in a book called History of Sex, she's talking about slang for different body parts. She's talking about words that are used for people who engage in sex work, words for the act of sex itself. I thought that this was a really nice way to start it because she is explaining why she's using certain terminology throughout the book. And then she goes on to just take pieces of history and aspects of sex and talk about them in historical context in short, pretty punchy chapters. Overall, I think this was really accurate. I really enjoyed this, in part because of my day job. A lot of this information was not super new to me. Some of it was, and I did find it really interesting. But I think at this point in my conversations and the research and the nonfiction, I guess, that I want to read that's specifically about sex itself, as opposed to things like how sex and gender interact with the medical system, I want something that's more specific, I guess. This is a really broad book, and a lot of it, because of its broad scope, it didn't get into certain topics as deeply as I would like. But if this is a topic that you're newly reading about, or you aren't familiar with like certain historical aspects about things like virginity and how it's a construct, or where the different etymologies for certain words and why they're swear words now come from, what is the history of certain medications that are used much more commonly in sex today than they were even 20 years ago, because they didn't exist 20 years ago. This might be a really good book for you to check out. I think it's sourced really well. I think that her tone is the perfect mix of like taking this topic seriously and also recognizing that for a lot of people it's an awkward topic and it's kind of funny. Like, sex is kind of a funny thing when you sit and think about it. But for me, this wasn't particularly new information for the most part, so I gave it a 3-star, but I would definitely recommend it to someone who doesn't have the weird day job that I do where this is a normal part of your work conversation. But overall, I think that her tone and her research really shines, and the short chapters also keep you engaged. Next, I want to talk about a book that I listened to, and it's a middle grade book. I don't read a lot of middle grade. I don't plan on taking on reading a lot of middle grade, but people I love very much who are in that reading range, and I wanted to connect with them, or I want to have more conversations with them about what they're reading, about what their interests are, and what better way to do that than to read books that are aimed at their age group or that they're already reading and talk to them about it. Because of that, I read the book Out of My Mind by Sharon M. Draper. I am not going to rate this book because it is absolutely not targeted at me. I do want to talk about some of the merits and potential flaws that I saw in this, but if I read a middle grade, unless I get deeply into reviewing middle grade, which I highly doubt, I don't plan on giving them ratings because it isn't fair for me to rate something that is clearly not targeted at me and not something that I am doing the work to understand what makes it good beyond my own enjoyment. I do have opinions on it though, because I have opinions on everything. This story follows a young girl. She is 11. I think she's 10 and a half or 11. She talks about it a lot early on in the book. And she is completely nonverbal as a result of having cerebral palsy. And the way that cerebral palsy presents in her is it is pretty severe. She's unable to speak. She does not have control over her vocal cords or most of her muscles. She does use a wheelchair. And for a long time, people were making assumptions about her intelligence, about her ability to communicate, and her willingness and desire to communicate with the world outside. While she can't speak and while she does have physical limitations, she has a photographic memory, an eidetic memory, and she is very smart for her age. She just cannot communicate that to most people for most of this book. She does have parents who advocate for her, and she does eventually not only start going to a regular school where she is eventually what I call mainstreaming. I'm sure there's a better term for it now, but she was in the special education classes, and she starts being introduced to go into the more quote-unquote mainstream classes with other students. And she also is able to get access to something called a MediTalk through the advocacy that she is able to figure out how to communicate these things with a neighbor who has watched her whole life, with her parents who are fighting for her, and with her school aide that she eventually gets as well. And the MediTalk allows her to communicate with her family, to say things like I love you, and also with teachers, other students, and start creating friendships and have people recognize, no, this is someone who, despite her physical limitations, does have the ability to communicate and to remember things and to possibly, and this is a plot point in the book, go to a competition, like a trivia competition that's really common in that age group. This character, I'm blanking on her name, she encounters a lot of troubles. Getting the MediTalk, getting a wheelchair, getting an aide doesn't automatically fix everything. She's bullied when she's mainstreamed into her classes. Her friend that she thinks she has struggles with wanting to be accepted by the girls who are bullying, and also actually wanting to be friends with this person because she is a pretty cool kid. And she runs into issues with accessibility with the teachers who should be advocating for her, not doing a good job with that too. And it's kind of heartbreaking sometimes. I do think that this book is a pretty positive thing for younger folks to read, especially if they don't have familiarity with people who have cerebral palsy. But I say that with a caveat that this should be opening up conversations. If you're an adult who is working with a kid, is a parent of a kid who is of this age and is interested in this book or has recently read this book, talk to them about disability, talk to them about how things like cerebral palsy have a spectrum, as well as other disabilities have a spectrum. And that includes recognizing that not everyone with cerebral palsy, not everybody with a disability is going to have I hate the superpower concept of having a perfectly photographic memory like the main character in this book does, because we don't want to encourage what a lot of people call inspiration porn. I do think this is a good intro in having conversations with kids about what some struggles someone with cerebral palsy or someone with another disability might have, and opening up other conversations. I did look into it. The author of this book, I believe her daughter has cerebral palsy, and it is clear that she does not want this to be inspiration porn, because she never downplays that this character still has struggles and is still just a fully formed person with flaws. One of the things I saw people complain about is this character, the main character, is occasionally unlikable. I'm like, yeah, she's an 11-year-old girl. A lot of us at 11 were relatively unlikable. We thought we knew everything, and it gets even worse when you get a little bit higher in your teens. So there's some of that 11-year-old snark that's not super sophisticated because she's 11 years old. So I think the voice in there is good. I don't think this is a parent trying to speak for someone with cerebral palsy. But I do think that this is something that if you know a young person who's really into this book or wants to read this book, definitely have those conversations with them. I'm glad that I read it. It's not something I would have picked up on my own, but I think that it opens a lot of doors to a lot of conversations, and I'm glad it exists as a book that's targeted at this age group. I also listened to the book How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu, and this is a sci-fi that spans the 2030s to the 2100s-ish, and actually arguably way beyond that, about 6,000 plus years in humanity's future, not necessarily on Earth. As you might be able to guess just from me talking about this time span that this follows, this is actually a number of interconnected stories. We're not following one person, but we are following a number of people throughout time, throughout Earth, and in space who have connections, whether those connections are super tenuous or they're like really, really strong, like familial connections. There is a connection from each chapter to the next, even though each chapter is also sort of its own separate story. And it starts with a man going to Siberia, to where the tundra is actually melting now, and to finish his daughter's work. She had died while doing an excavation when they found a Neanderthal girl, and they were studying her. And there are concerns at this base that this exposure of this Neanderthal girl and some of the tests they've done might unearth some viruses. In case you didn't know, that's something that's already happening as the permafrost melts. So this is a pandemic book, but the parallels are not COVID parallels. They are climate change concerns. And while, yes, this is about pandemic fears, this is about cynicism, this is about climate change, this is about space travel and what are humanity's limits, what is the limit of our empathy, this ultimately is a group of stories and a actually cohesive story. It does all come together at the end, kind of, about grief and about how humans connect, not just through grief, but how we have to be resilient through death. And I kind of like its take on humans are special. If you know about that trope or that concept, when you think about a lot of sci-fi, you see this in Star Trek, you see a lot where humans are very resilient, and the fact that we've been able to overcome everything that we have is kind of unique to all these other species that have been seeded throughout the galaxy. Minor spoilers for a really old show. I liked this take on it because it's more about our connectivity and not so much about like we are explorers and we're really tough and smart, because it also talks about how kind of gruesome we can be and how capitalism can really prey on those things. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. It's really hard to talk about this book without getting super overarching because it follows overarching themes. I have seen people compare this to Cloud Atlas. I have not read Cloud Atlas, but from what I know about that story, there are similarities, but it sounds like there is enough distinction that this is something that you could really enjoy even if you didn't particularly like Cloud Atlas, or if you haven't read it like I haven't. I did give this 4 stars. I think that this interconnection is actually really difficult to do, and I think for the most part, Nagamatsu really succeeded. And some of the stories, okay, so I started reading this after getting some bad news, and there is not a good time to read a book that includes a chapter about a theme park that has a roller coaster that is meant to euthanize children who have contracted an incurable disease. That's just not a good time to read this kind of book, but that gives you kind of an example of the dystopia of the capitalist society that happens after this pandemic begins. What the pandemic is it's a disease, and it's never fully explained, and I think that's for the better, because 1, it makes it creepier, and 2, it opens up space to explore other parts of the story. But what this pandemic, or what this virus does, once you have been infected with it, which it seems like it's through water and fish, like infected fish, it's not an airborne virus, and it mostly affects children at the beginning, but then it mutates and spreads out and impacts the entire world to the point where our grieving rituals and our funerals are completely changed. For example, a euthanasia roller coaster. My issue with that story is it does happen relatively quickly. It's like within 6 years of the pandemic starting, and I'm like, that seems a bit fast, but with everything that's happened in the last 2.5 years, Who knows? Maybe I'm just being a bit optimistic. What this disease does is once you're infected, it changes your cells in your body to want to be other cells. So where you have a heart, those cells start to grow into a lung. Or where you have a kidney, those cells start to grow into a heart, which, as you can imagine, causes a lot of problems. There are different stories throughout as time passes, where you'll meet a character who works at this euthanasia park, and then you meet him in the next story briefly, even though he's not the main character. And then you find out from the story about this kind of interdimensional space where people who are ill and in a coma because of this disease are able to meet each other. And you find out that a baby in that story is actually a grandmother who's just passed away in a story much later in the book. So there is this ongoing thread that does get wrapped up at the end. Why were all these people connected? I mostly liked the way that it was connected. There's a line in the last chapter about Atlantis that really made me kind of... I'm not a big fan of how... I wouldn't say this was super realistic science fiction, but it is meant to be a speculative exaggeration of what could happen. And a nod to Atlantis as if it were real just kind of bothers me. There's not a lot I can say about this that other people haven't said in a much more intelligent way, but this might be another book. I want to go through this book and reread it to find those connections. There's a couple recurring things, and there's one in particular that recurs that I want to see how often it happens. Now that I've read it once, I think going back again, I would get a lot more out of this book, and probably even more insight into what the author was trying to say about how grief is intrinsically linked with human connection. That is a huge part of this story. We grieve people that we've lost. We grieve what we could have had. We grieve relationships. We grieve our past selves, and all of that is expressed in this book, which is interesting to say about a book that also has, a euthanasia roller coaster and a telepathic pig that reads a lot like a Black Mirror episode. It's a pretty intense book. I highly recommend it. I did give it 4 stars. There were a couple things that I think were either a little convoluted, and then a few things in that very, very last chapter, while it connected a lot of things, has kind of made me a little frustrated with some of the implications of the suggestion that the author was making, but I really overall thought this was great. And last but not least, I read Revenge by Yoko Ogawa, and it was translated by Stephen Snyder. Funnily enough, Revenge, which I read right after How High We Go in the Dark, is another book that is a series of stories that are all interlinked. Although this one, not so much about like climate change or grief, but more like anger and rage and revenge, as suggested by the title of the book. This is more even of a short story collection than an overarching novel like How High We Go in the Dark, although you could argue they both are overarching novels. I think actually in How High You Go in the Dark, most of the stories could stand alone, where there are a few stories in Revenge that if you aren't reading them in the context of the book, they lose their impact, particularly the first story and the last story. It's very important, the overarching narrative, the way that it all connects again, and it is kind of a circle. I didn't enjoy this quite as much as How High We Go in the Dark, but I did rate it 4 stars, if only because I'm still processing it. Some of it is most likely because this is a translated work, and I have read a book by Yoko Ogawa before, and I loved it. It was The Memory Police. I can't remember if I gave it 4 or 5 stars, but I thought it was fantastic. And I know a lot of people thought that ending was terrible, and it just, I loved it. It was so full of longing and dread, and I think that it doesn't get enough praise, even though I think it also might be her most famous English translated work, because I know in Japan she's written like 20 books, but we only have 4 or 5 translated in English, which is a shame, because even though I didn't like Revenge as much as The Memory Police, this had a very like Edgar Allan Poe-esque vibe to it, which I am so glad is what I read to end September and really kick off spooky season going into October. For example, some of the stories seem kind of not particularly out there. There's a story about a young woman who goes to meet her father for the first time and has asked the young man to come with her, and it goes pretty poorly, and then they find this abandoned post office full of kiwis, and she eats a ton of them in front of him to like process her pain in front of him, and then doesn't hear from her afterwards. And that actually is connected to the previous story and then a later story as well, which I thought was pretty artful. Again, these stories are a lot shorter, so it's harder for me to say these aren't short story collections than with How High We Go in the Dark, but How High We Go in the Dark, absolutely some of those stories could be standalones. I don't think any of these really could, because you just don't get the same impact. It will kind of fall flat. You'll be like, okay, what was the point of that story? Oh, now I see what's happening and where these threads are coming on. I'm sure that there's commentary in here too about anger and revenge and societal norms in Japanese culture that I'm probably not as familiar with. That's part of why I want to read books by authors from cultures other than mine and learn more about the world as a whole, kind of going back to that connectedness that both of these stories have. And maybe I'm just being hard on myself, and I am fully understanding like the fact that this is a story that goes in a circle and that it is talking about some of these stories are really mundane, and how there's actually some really horrifying things in mundanity if you look a little bit closer. And how those connections and how we all are connected can not only be really affirming and help us through things like grief, but can also be kind of horrifying when you think about it. For example, I guess a good way for me to put that is, have any of you ever like briefly missed an accident or been somewhere where then the next day something really horrible happened, and your first thought when you hear about it is, that could have been me, I was just there. It's kind of a horrifying thing when you think about it, but it's also just so human that we want to be connected, whether it's through grief, which is a horrible thing, but an important part of the human process, whether it's happiness and connecting through our friends and family, or whether it's something horrible and tragic and macabre. I'm kind of going off on weird tangents that I don't know if it even makes sense for me to include in this review. I did give this 4 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. I'm super glad it's how I ended my reading month. If you've made it this far with me through this rambly review, I really appreciate it. I plan on doing some deep dives on books in the coming months and continuing to read. I'm really excited for spooky season, but I am going to be super busy, so we'll see what happens. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.